There are many ways to end a professional partnership, and almost all of them are better than what David Bowie did to Mick Ronson at Hammersmith Odeon. He could have told the band privately before the show, giving them time to process and prepare. He could have made the announcement after a final tour, where everyone knew it was ending. He could have framed it as a mutual decision, or at least consulted his musical partners before making such a dramatic choice. Instead, he chose the most theatrical and cruel option possible. He killed Ziggy Stardust on stage in front of thousands of people, and in doing so, he killed Mick Ronson's career without giving him any say in the matter. The announcement wasn't just about retiring a character, it was about dissolving the band, ending the partnerships, moving on to something new that apparently didn't include the people who had made Ziggy successful in the first place. For Ronson, who had poured 2 years of his life and talent into creating Ziggy's sound, who had been loyal and collaborative and essential to every success they had achieved, being dismissed this way felt like execution. He had been killed on stage alongside Ziggy, but unlike the character, Ronson was a real person, with real feelings and a real career that was now in jeopardy. If you want to discover how David Bowie's most famous character destroyed his most important musical partnership, subscribe to our channel now, because Ziggy's death killed more than just a persona. The partnership begins. Mick Ronson entered David Bowie's life in 1970, recommended by producer Tony Visconti as a guitarist who could bring technical skill and rock credibility to Bowie's increasingly ambitious musical projects. Ronson, from Hull in northern England, was a classically trained musician with working-class roots who had played in various bands without achieving significant success. When he met Bowie, who was himself still struggling for breakthrough after years of failed attempts at stardom, there was an immediate creative chemistry despite their very different personalities and backgrounds. Bowie was theatrical, intellectual, sexually ambiguous, and obsessed with image and performance. Ronson was straightforward, masculine, focused entirely on music rather than visual presentation, and completely uninterested in the theatrical aspects of rock and roll that fascinated Bowie. But these differences became complementary rather than conflicting, creating a partnership where Bowie could focus on concepts and characters, while Ronson handled the musical substance that made those concepts work. Their collaboration began with The Man Who Sold the World album in 1970, where Ronson's heavy guitar sound gave Bowie's songs a rock credibility they had previously lacked. But the partnership truly crystallized during the creation of Ziggy Stardust in 1971 and early 1972. Bowie had the concept, an androgynous alien rock star bringing messages to Earth, but Ronson created the sound that made Ziggy iconic. His guitar arrangements on songs like Moonage Daydream and Suffragette City were instantly recognizable and influential, combining glam rock theatricality with hard rock power. His string arrangements on songs like Life on Mars added sophistication and emotional depth. And his work as de facto musical director during recording sessions, helping shape arrangements and guiding other musicians, was essential to transforming Bowie's theatrical vision into actual music that people could listen to and love. The success of Ziggy Stardust wasn't just Bowie's triumph, it was a collaborative achievement that neither man could have accomplished alone. The Ziggy phenomenon. When Ziggy Stardust exploded into cultural phenomenon in 1972, transforming David Bowie from struggling artist into genuine rock star, Mick Ronson was there at every step. He was the stoic figure on stage in platform boots and silver suits, his masculine presence providing visual and musical counterpoint to Bowie's flamboyant androgyny. The famous moment during performances when Bowie would simulate oral sex on Ronson's guitar became one of Ziggy's most iconic and controversial images, a transgressive gesture that challenged rock's aggressive heterosexuality and suggested that everything about Ziggy was sexually ambiguous and dangerous. But behind the theatrical staging, Ronson was doing the actual musical work that made the show function. His guitar solos were the moments of genuine musical transcendence in performances that could otherwise tip into camp or pure theater. His arrangements were what made audiences hear glam rock as legitimate music rather than just costume party. The creative dynamic between Bowie and Ronson during the Ziggy period was complex and productive, but also increasingly unequal in terms of public recognition and financial reward. Bowie was the star, the face of Ziggy, the one giving interviews and appearing on magazine covers. Ronson was the sideman, credited for his playing, but treated by the press and public as supporting player rather than equal partner. This disparity existed despite the fact that Ronson's contributions were absolutely essential to Ziggy's success, that his guitar work and arrangements were what made the albums actually listenable, rather than just interesting concepts. Bowie would later acknowledge this inequality, describing Ronson as having been criminally underappreciated during the Ziggy years. But during the actual period when it mattered, when recognition and credit were being distributed, Ronson received a fraction of what his contributions deserved, and this imbalance created tensions that would make the eventual breakup even more painful. The decision to kill Ziggy. By early 1973, David Bowie had decided that Ziggy Stardust needed to die. The character had achieved everything Bowie had hoped for, and more. Massive commercial success, cultural impact, transformation of his career from struggling artist to rock star. But Bowie was also feeling trapped by Ziggy's success, concerned that the character was overwhelming his own identity, worried that continuing to perform as Ziggy would mean becoming stuck in a single role, rather than continuing to evolve artistically. He had always conceived of Ziggy as temporary, a character that would be performed and then retired once it had served its purpose. And by 1973, that purpose had been achieved. The problem was that everyone else involved in Ziggy, the band members, the management, the record label, had been assuming this would continue indefinitely, that Ziggy's success meant they were building a long-term vehicle that would sustain careers for years to come. Bowie made the decision to retire Ziggy sometime in the spring of 1973, but he chose not to share this decision with his band or collaborators. His reasoning, as he would later explain in interviews, was partly theatrical. He wanted Ziggy's death to be dramatic and shocking, a true retirement of the character that would have impact and meaning. But there was also a more personal and less admirable motivation. Bowie had already begun thinking about what would come after Ziggy, and those plans didn't include Mick Ronson or the Spiders from Mars. He was preparing to move in new musical directions, to work with different musicians, to leave behind the glam rock sound that Ronson had helped create. By not telling the band what was coming, Bowie avoided difficult conversations about why they were being left behind, avoided having to justify or defend his decision to end partnerships that had been essential to his success. The silence was strategic, but also cruel, leaving Ronson and the others to plan for a future that Bowie knew wasn't going to exist. The Hammersmith Odeon night, July 3, 1973, started as just another concert in the Ziggy Stardust tour. The Hammersmith Odeon in London was a prestigious venue, and performing there felt like homecoming after months of touring internationally. The show that night was recorded for a planned live album, adding extra pressure to deliver a perfect performance. Mick Ronson and the rest of the Spiders from Mars had no indication that this night would be different from any other show. They performed brilliantly. The audience was ecstatic. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. As the concert moved toward its conclusion, Bowie prepared to make an announcement that he had shared with almost no one, that would shock the music world and devastate the people standing on stage beside him. During the encore, before the final song, Bowie stepped to the microphone and said, "Of all the shows on this tour, this particular show will remain with us the longest, because not only is it the last show of the tour, but it's the last show that we'll ever do. Thank you. The words hung in the air for a moment, the audience not immediately processing what they had heard. Then confusion rippled through the venue, people trying to understand whether Bowie meant this was the last show of this tour or whether he was saying something more permanent. Bowie's follow-up comments made it clear. Ziggy Stardust was being retired, and this was the character's final performance. The crowd responded with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and sadness, many people crying or sitting in stunned silence, while others cheered for what felt like a historic moment. But the most devastating reactions were from the people on stage. Mick Ronson, standing just feet away from Bowie with his guitar, was learning he was out of a job at the same moment as everyone else. Drummer Woody Woodmansey and bassist Trevor Bolder were similarly blindsided, realizing that the Spiders from Mars were being dissolved without any advance warning or discussion. The final song of the night took on a surreal quality, the band playing while processing the shock of what they had just heard, knowing that this performance was also for their partnership and their careers. When the final notes faded and the band left the stage, the usual post-concert euphoria was replaced by confusion and anger. Ronson's tears as he walked off stage were witnessed by multiple crew members and other musicians, a visceral display of the hurt and betrayal he was feeling in that moment. The immediate aftermath, the hours following the Hammersmith Odeon performance, were characterized by confusion, anger, and desperate attempts to understand what had just happened and what it meant for everyone's future. Backstage, band members and crew demanded explanations from Bowie and his management, trying to determine whether this announcement was truly final or whether it might be reversed. Bowie was elusive, celebrating the successful execution of his theatrical retirement, while avoiding substantive discussions about the practical implications for the musicians who had helped create Ziggy. Mick Ronson, still processing the shock and public humiliation of learning he was being dismissed in front of thousands of people, struggled to articulate his feelings or demand explanations. The British tendency to avoid confrontation and the rock world's habit of framing everything as cool and detached made it difficult for anyone to simply state the obvious, that what had happened was cruel and unfair, that Bowie had betrayed people who had been loyal and essential to his success. The music press immediately seized on the story, with headlines announcing Ziggy's death and speculating about what Bowie would do next. But in most of these articles, Mick Ronson and the Spiders from Mars were afterthoughts, mentioned briefly as the band that would no longer be working with Bowie, but not explored as people whose careers had just been devastated. The narrative became about Bowie's bold, artistic decision to retire a successful character, rather than about the human cost of that decision, about the musicians who had helped create Ziggy, but were now being discarded without ceremony or gratitude. This framing reflected and reinforced the fundamental inequality of the Bowie-Ronson partnership. Bowie was the artist making brave choices, while Ronson was merely a sideman who could be replaced without significantly altering Bowie's trajectory. Ronson's struggle for solo career. In the months following Ziggy's death, Mick Ronson attempted to launch the solo career that many had predicted would be successful, given his talent and his association with Bowie. RCA Records, Bowie's label, signed Ronson and released his debut album Slaughter on 10th Avenue in 1974. The album showcased Ronson's guitar virtuosity and included some strong songwriting, but it failed to achieve significant commercial success or critical recognition. The problem wasn't lack of talent. Ronson was arguably a better pure musician than Bowie. The problem was that Ronson lacked Bowie's theatrical vision, his ability to create compelling personas and narratives, his understanding of how to manipulate media and public perception. Ronson was a brilliant musician who needed a visionary partner to package and present his abilities. And without Bowie, he struggled to establish his own artistic identity that could compete in the increasingly competitive rock marketplace of the mid-1970s. The failure of Ronson's solo career was painful not just professionally, but personally, because it seemed to validate the unequal partnership dynamic that had existed during the Ziggy years. It suggested that Bowie had been the essential element, the genius who could work with any competent musicians, while Ronson had been merely talented support whose contributions were replaceable. This narrative was fundamentally untrue. Ziggy's sound had been collaborative creation, but the commercial failure of Ronson's solo work made it difficult to argue otherwise. Over the following years, Ronson became a respected session musician and producer, working with Lou Reed, Ian Hunter, Morrissey, and numerous others. This work demonstrated his versatility and musical intelligence, but it also represented a kind of defeat, an acceptance that he would be support player for other people's visions rather than the star of his own projects. The financial inequality. One aspect of the Bowie-Ronson partnership that became increasingly painful after the breakup was the massive financial disparity between what the two men had earned during the Ziggy years. Bowie, as the star and primary songwriter, had made substantial money from album sales, publishing rights, and concert revenues. Ronson, as a salaried band member, had been paid for his performances and studio work, but received nothing from record sales or publishing, despite his arrangements and guitar parts being essential to the song's success. This financial structure was standard in the music industry, where stars own the songs and sidemen receive session wages, but it created situations where Ronson's essential contributions to Ziggy's success had earned him a tiny fraction of what Bowie had made from the same work. After the breakup, as Bowie continued to earn money from Ziggy Stardust album sales and his career moved forward successfully, while Ronson struggled financially and professionally, the unfairness of this arrangement became increasingly obvious. Ronson had helped create something that would generate income for Bowie for decades, but he had no ownership stake in that creation and no ongoing financial benefit from its continued success. There were moments when Bowie would hire Ronson for session work or touring, paying him as a hired musician to play the parts he had originally created, a situation that underscored the fundamental power imbalance. Ronson needed the work and the money, so he accepted these arrangements, but they must have felt like being paid to reproduce your own creations as if they belonged to someone else. The partial reconciliation. Despite the hurt and betrayal of the Hammersmith Odeon night, David Bowie and Mick Ronson did work together occasionally in the years following Ziggy's death. Ronson appeared on several of Bowie's albums in the late 1970s and 1980s, providing guitar work that drew on their established chemistry. He toured with Bowie during various periods, returning to perform the Ziggy-era songs for audiences nostalgic for that glam rock era. These collaborations were professionally productive and demonstrated that musical understanding between them remained strong despite personal tensions. But according to people close to both men, the relationship was never truly repaired. The easy intimacy and creative trust that had characterized their work during the Ziggy years was gone, replaced by a more formal and business-like dynamic where Ronson was clearly hired help rather than genuine partner. The partial nature of this reconciliation became clear in interviews both men gave about their partnership. Bowie would express appreciation for Ronson's contributions and occasionally acknowledge that he should have handled the Ziggy breakup differently, but he never fully owned the cruelty of the Hammersmith Odeon announcement or addressed the financial inequities that characterized their partnership. Ronson, for his part, generally avoided criticizing Bowie publicly, maintaining professional courtesy, even when privately he harbored resentment about how he had been treated. This pattern, Bowie expressing vague regret without making meaningful amends, Ronson accepting crumbs of acknowledgement without demanding real accountability, characterized their interactions for 2 decades, leaving essential issues unaddressed and wounds unhealed. Ronson's illness and death. In 1991, Mick Ronson was diagnosed with liver cancer. He continued working as long as physically possible, playing sessions and concerts even as his health deteriorated. David Bowie, learning of the diagnosis, reached out with support and arranged for Ronson to receive the best medical care possible. This late-stage generosity was genuine, but also tragic, a demonstration of care that came only when Ronson was dying, when it was too late to repair the relationship or address the inequities that had characterized their partnership. Ronson died on April 29, 1993, at just 46 years old, dying far too young and never having received the recognition or financial success that his contributions to rock music deserved. Bowie's response to Ronson's death was emotional and public. He spoke about Ronson's genius in interviews, performed tribute concerts, and for years afterward, would become visibly emotional when discussing the guitarist, who had been essential to his breakthrough success. These tributes were sincere, but they also carried the weight of regret and guilt, the recognition that Ronson had died without their partnership ever being fully reconciled or their creative collaboration properly credited. Bowie would spend the rest of his career being more careful with collaborators, more explicitly crediting the musicians who contributed to his work, more generous in sharing recognition and financial rewards. But this lesson came too late for Ronson, who had borne the cost of being the first essential partner that Bowie learned to properly value only after it was too late to make things right. The legacy question. The story of David Bowie and Mick Ronson raises uncomfortable questions about artistic ownership, credit, and the exploitation of talent in the music industry. When people remember Ziggy Stardust, they remember David Bowie, the visual concept, the androgynous alien persona, the theatrical performances. Mick Ronson, when remembered at all, is a footnote, the talented guitarist who helped create the sound. This historical narrative is a victory for Bowie's version of events, but a profound injustice to Ronson's contributions. Without Ronson's guitar work and arrangements, Ziggy Stardust would have been just another interesting concept, without musical substance to support it. Without Ronson's stage presence providing masculine counterpoint to Bowie's androgyny, the visual presentation would have been less dynamic and compelling. Without Ronson's loyalty and musical intelligence during years of collaboration, Bowie might never have achieved breakthrough at all. The Hammersmith Odeon announcement was the moment when Bowie definitively asserted his version of the story, that Ziggy was his creation, that band members were replaceable, that he could kill the character and move on without consulting the people who had made it successful. The tears Ronson shed walking off stage that night were not just about losing a job or ending a partnership. They were about watching history being written in real time, watching his contributions being erased, understanding that he would be remembered as sideman to Bowie's genius rather than as the collaborative partner who had made that genius actually manifest as memorable music. The subsequent decades, with Bowie's continued success and Ronson's relative obscurity, confirmed what was established that night at Hammersmith Odeon. That fame and credit follow the performer rather than the musician, the concept creator rather than the sound architect, the person who can kill a character dramatically rather than the person who made that character worth killing.